This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from Warringing Land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke. It's a pleasure to be with you from Gadigal Land, and thanks for remembering my intro.
Well, my understanding is that is just the standing introduction moving forward, and I got so burnt last time I left it out, I thought I'd just continue the tradition.
Wise choice, Menzel.
And a man with a meme game that not even COVID can derail, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
It derailed it a little bit. My online output has slowed to the merest trickle in the past week.
I was impressed that you announced the world that you had COVID with a Ferris Bueller meme, and I wasn't sure to interpret that as just you were taking off for a day of fun and frivolity across Melbourne, or whether you were actually sick.
I took off for a day of fun and frivolity across my eyelids. If that makes no sense, well, welcome to my last week.
On this week's show, we look at a paper that calls for ramping up research efforts on truly catastrophic climate change scenarios. But Frankie and Tennant, I understand that you've both seen cause to reconvene Energy Crisis Corner.
Yeah, because things are not going that well out there in global energy land, and there's an overseas dimension to that, and there's a local dimension to that that's not so good. Frankie, where should we start?
Why don't we begin our tour of Global Energy Crisis Corner in the UK?
The happiest place on earth.
So it is, the last couple of weeks. We have seen the newly minted UK Prime Minister Liz Truss.
Newly minted and rapidly tarnished.
Rapidly tarnished.
Prime Minister Truss.
With the promise of trickle-down economics and high-end tax cuts being reversed pretty early on. I think one of the things she has been compelled to run with, seemingly at odds with the sort of economic orthodoxy she espoused on the way in. They have put in place a very expensive program to support people with energy bills over the next 2 years, where they're capping people's bills. I understand they won't be any household won't be paying more than, I think, £2,500 for energy, which is still a huge amount of money. And I think I saw some reporting that suggested that was, almost double what energy costs were, not too long ago. But that's going to be coming in at a significant amount of money. It was in the order of, I might get this wrong, £100 billion or something. We're talking big dollars.
That might be the 2-year figure. I was seeing $40 billion over winter as the top end estimate, but I think they've committed to it over 2 years.
It's a 2-year program. The other sort of interesting features of what's been happening in the UK in the last couple of weeks is some commentary from their climate minister that they indeed won't be asking people to save energy or consider not running appliances in the way that the European mainland is doing and has committed a lot of focus on, particularly from governments. We talked a lot about Germany previously around some of the measures they're putting in place, really lowering energy use in public buildings, turning off public fountains, lighting and things like that, whilst they boost their gas reserves. But the UK is sort of taking the stance that they're not going to tell people what to do. But the other thing that they are looking to introduce is this energy flexibility service where they will pay people not to run certain appliances at times of peak. So it's a sort of a consumer demand response type scheme. And they're looking to ramp that up over the winter. And I think they also said they will run it over, at least a kind of dozen periods to try get buy-in and get participation in the scheme. So lots going on in the UK. And then perhaps in handing the baton over to Tennant, I took some delight in the French announcing their own initiative.
What did they call it?
They called it, I've been so waiting for this, La Sobriété Énergétique, which is the energy sobriety campaign.
Sobriety?
Sobriety,
wow.
That's right. And effectively they're targeting 10% energy usage drop over the next couple of years. And there's a lot of voluntary measures sitting under that.
No more energy bon vivants. It's only energy sobriety.
Only energy teetotalers.
That's right. I love it.
Well, they might need a bit of that beyond the borders of France because the European situation gets worse and worse. The situation with the Russian gas supplies to Europe has gone from thin excuses to stark, we're just not sending you the gas, and now to mysterious, somebody blew up the pipelines in 4 places, massive methane leaks that are gradually stopping, and really a very clear signal of no going back on Russian energy supplies to Europe. But what to do about it remains in a work in progress. And as we speak, the European institutions are debating how to pay for the Repower EU plan that will essentially end their reliance on Russian gas this decade, or enable them to do entirely without Russian gas. And in a link back to occasional themes of this podcast, one of the major irons in the fire for paying for that plan is to repurpose the innovation fund that was proposed in the Fit for 55 package, which is basically funded by the CBAM. Indirectly through all of the allowances for carbon emissions that otherwise would have been given away for free to industry, and which will instead be auctioned to provide a sack of cash for the European Parliament or Commission or Council of Ministers, or all of them in a tug of war to do something with. It was going to be help industry be more competitive, but maybe now it's going to be help industry and everybody else get off Russian gas.
So when is that slated to come into effect? When would the spigot of CBAM cash start flowing?
So that still is up for debate. It's looking like the start of the financial obligations part of CBAM might start a year later than previously proposed by the Commission. So maybe in 2026-27. But also, it might be that the phase down of the free allocation of units, which would help to that phase down of the free allocation would help fund the innovation fund. That might go faster. So it's all a bit up in the air. Everybody's very head up about the details, but the broad brushstrokes seem to be that climate policy reform, energy policy reform, and European security policy are sort of going arm in arm in a way that's like a pretty shiny silver lining on what is going to be a pretty ugly couple of years. The consequence of all this stuff going on overseas is still that locally it looks like next couple of years are going to be an absolute shocker for energy users in Eastern Australia, and the power futures, base futures price for 2023 is above $240 a megawatt hour in New South Wales and Queensland. The net back price of gas for next year is currently averaging above $60 a gigajoule. It's bad Like, that's my deep insight. It's bad.
Seems to be where all of these conversations finish. What are the implications for Australia? Bit rubbish. Bit rubbisher every time we talk about them, really, right?
Yep. That's the trend. We need to extend out the rubbish axis a little further every time we speak. I think the prospect of sky-high energy prices, global recession, geopolitical conflict, it's a great time to be looking at a paper about even more depressing things to make our contemporary problems look like slightly rosier by comparison.
Shall we talk about a report about climate catastrophe?
I promise there will be uplift before the end. But yes, I'm up for catastrophe.
Agent of chaos.
The phrase a climate catastrophe is regularly bandied about, but how much effort have scientists actually put into understanding how truly apocalyptic climate change would play out? Nowhere near enough, according to a new paper entitled Climate Endgame, Exploring Catastrophic Climate Change Scenarios. In it, the authors catalogue the shortcomings of existing research, define key terms, and propose a so-called Climate Endgame research agenda that properly addresses the threat of extreme climate change and what we can do about it. Tennant, this is a pretty sobering paper.
Yeah, it's really surprising to consider, given how often the public rhetoric of the climate crisis refers to catastrophe and existential risk, that, as the authors note, there's just not that much research on that part of it. That most of the work that is done, in fact, the overwhelming bulk of the work that is done on climate change is looking at relatively lower end impacts and the impacts that are, I guess, easier and more orderly to understand. Maybe this is actually starting to explain itself as I talk, rather than what might happen if we really, really screw the pooch or get particularly unlucky with the level of climate sensitivity, or when we start to consider the knock-on ramifications of climate extremes and climate pressures for fragile human economic and social systems. I don't think that they, in this paper, do that much to settle the question of like how much risk is there or what might the consequences be. This is a more basic piece of work than that. This is saying there is an important set of questions here that are understudied, and here's both some reasons to bother looking and some directions that we might realistically, or they think we might realistically aspire to fill out with research to put us in a better place where these catastrophic risks are able to play more of a part in decision making, informing both elite and democratic decision making on climate.
Maybe let's start with some of the reasons for why, climate scientists, academics, researchers haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what happens if, we go completely over the cliff, shoot past 4 or 5 degrees, and, we everything starts to spiral. There's kind of like a normative impulse, they suggest, because we've got Paris and we're sort of shooting for these 1.52 degrees scenarios, that there's a tendency to try and to focus effort around that and to understand, the various interactions and scenarios that are delivering an outcome that are, within QE of a 1.52 degree temperature rise. There's also this really interesting one that they highlighted, that climate scientists don't want to be accused of alarmism.
Yeah. that they err on the side of less drama, which I thought was like an interesting take. But I think possibly one of the better explanations for that as well, when you understand the process by which an IPCC report is produced, there's sort of this enormous undertaking of consensus building across, thousands of people in the scientific community.
And ultimately, the national government's representatives have to approve.
That is true, but they weren't saying that, there's iconoclasts out there that are studying sort of extreme climate impacts and they're not getting included in this consensus process. They're saying that the research is not even being done.
Yes.
Which is not to say that the IPCC process might not kind of create kind of a boundary of sort of acceptable research. If that's what everybody's feeding into, maybe that's sort of helping to define the research priorities at the wide end of the funnel, as well as the sorting process about which research ultimately lands within that IPCC report.
Fair enough. The point that I think the authors of this paper make really well is that understanding extreme risks is important for proper decision making, and that, it's sort of naive and bad risk management not to consider, bad to worst case scenarios, and that this is an area that's been neglected or I guess underrepresented relative to the likelihood of the kinds of impacts we're talking about. I think one of the points they make is that, the current trajectory that we're on would see, the world on track for a temperature rise between 2 and 3.9 degrees by the end of the century. And even if all of our 2030 contributions, from all the nations signed up to Paris were fully implemented, we're still looking at least 2.4 degrees. And so there's quite a high likelihood that we could be looking at a 3-degree future at the end of the century, and yet there's far less work that's been put into looking at what are the risks associated with a 3-degree scenario.
And an example of that that has stuck with me, it's not in this paper, but there is a Queensland government plan for climate adaptation. And that plan says this is a plan for adapting to 2 degrees of warming. We're aware that it is possible that we may get more than 2 degrees of warming, but this is a plan for 2 degrees. And the plan is to succeed on more within the bounds of what we currently consider success on climate change. And there's no plan for failure. Now, of course, the scenarios that these authors are talking about are a good deal worse than just, we wind up with 2.5 degrees, not 2, and we've got sort of linearly worse effects from that. They're talking about what if you get a major acceleration of warming through the thaw of permafrost and the release of methane that is trapped in permafrost? What if the Amazon turns from a sink of emissions into a source of emissions? What if you get a slowing of a whole range of global carbon sinks? What if you get a cascade of tipping points leading to a significantly greater level of overall warming? But that's not all. I mean, the social and economic tipping points are preying on their minds at least as much as the physical ones. And I think that one reason why there might not be so much research on some of this stuff is it's pretty hard to say what might happen.
It's complicated, right? And the further out you get from where we are now, the more complex it is to try and categorise the various ways things could go wrong, and importantly the ways all those various things could interact. Because my big takeaway from this is, oh shit, we're talking about a Rube Goldberg machine of climate disaster, of everything sort of impacting everything else simultaneously and potentially spiralling out of control. And to make to put a finer point on something you said around those, what were they called? That tipping cascade is the phrase that they use. That could happen even if we're very successful.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of reducing anthropogenic emissions, because things like the melting of permafrost can create feedback loops that could plausibly get away from us. And so, in the context of that adaptation plan that you mentioned from Queensland, it's not really much of a risk mitigation strategy if your strategy is to assume everything goes well.
Correct. Which I think is the central point that, that these folks are trying to make. And I think it's true that it's complex, but that's not a reason not to have a focus on these things. And as I say, the climate risks, and we've talked about this before in our episode on IAMs, climate risks have fat tails. We're talking about low probability but very high impact, extreme outcome type events. And I think they didn't make this point explicitly, but we're all living through, hopefully, the tail end of a global pandemic. Another relatively low probability, but high impact and consequential event that sort of created enormous ramifications across the globe. But they point out that countries and organisations like the WHO do planning around this kind of thing, right? That they have international task forces that look at what would happen if we have endemics and pandemics that touch the globe, and that it wasn't like there was nothing to call on when COVID-19 sort of came to us and elicited responses from governments around the world. So I think one of the other points they make really well, I guess it's sort of one of the things that they suggest should happen off the back of more work, is to think about how the international community comes together to talk about these things or plan for catastrophic climate change in a more structured way. I think the way they call it up is to talk about a tail risk treaty, where you would see an agreement or some sort of protocol put in place that would activate stronger commitments and actions from countries around the world when some of these indicators, potentially around tipping points and things like that, are triggered.
I might say I wasn't that impressed with that idea.
Really?
Largely because by the time you're getting the indicators that you're hitting tipping points for catastrophic climate change, it might be a touch late.
I think that's a broader problem with this paper, because they are sketching a research agenda that it's quite a complex agenda. We can go into the details of it, but it seems to me that to establish a satisfactory set of not even models, but bases for thinking about models for the kind of interplay of global health systems, economic systems, political systems, the cascades of intersecting effects, and produce something out of that tells you something about climate catastrophic risk that is quantitative enough to plug into policy processes or, God help us, IAMs or something. By the time you've done that, well, look, either you've locked in those impacts or you haven't. I think that it might still be a worthwhile exercise, because catastrophic risks, they make the point that this would be relevant to potentially a bunch of catastrophic risks, and certainly climate is not the only set of catastrophic risks that we've got. And it's not going to make them all go away if we do what we need to on climate. But I think I'm not sure how much of a contribution this has to make to getting done what we need to do on climate. My extra point here is just that it really did bring home to me, despite the stereotypes, how much the case for climate action to date does not rest in any sense on catastrophic risks. It's all about the middle of the road case for relatively more predictable stuff being bad.
Oh, sure. If we were talking about this kind of stuff every day, you would think stronger responses would be elicited to avoid them.
Which is one of the points that the authors are making. They are talking about the communications effort that could sit around sort of more robust characterisation of what some of those catastrophic risks are. You know, morbidity and mortality, like scaring the bejesus out of people is, I think, one of the things that they anticipate would happen by more of a focus on this agenda, which is like, what if a quarter of the world's population dies? That's, I believe, it's one of the definitions in their defining the terms of climate cataclysm section of the paper, which...
They've got a happy little terminology, happy little dictionary of defining extinction, social fragility, social collapse, global catastrophic risk, global decimation risk, endgame, extreme climate change is anything above 3C for them. They say, like, pre-existing terminology, existential risk, they think it's all just far too vague.
Well, but I think that there is a salient point in there because the terms like catastrophic climate change and you know, extinction are kind of, like, they are definitely used and thrown about, but it doesn't seem that there's any consistency in the way that they're applied. So I think they have a point in wanting to define a common lexicon for how we talk about just how bad things might get.
I guess the case for what these authors are trying to do is that a policy world, an international diplomacy world, where stuff has got to be quantified to even have a chance of counting, where those bloody integrated assessment models play a big role. If you don't have stuff that you can plug in to those, then you're just left with these like expected outcomes, and risk largely falls away. So let's try and correct that by studying and quantifying the risks more. And I think that's a great idea. I just think it's really hard.
So, look, the image I had in my head as I was reading this is like you've got the car is speeding towards the cliff, right? And do you spend your time trying to work out how to stop the car going off the cliff, or do you spend your time trying to characterise how bad it will be when the car crashes into the ravine and blows up to motivate the folk in the car to pay a bit more attention to putting their feet on the brakes?
Yes.
Like,
what if there's a bus full of orphans at the bottom of the cliff that you're going to land on and kill?
Yes, that would be even worse. It's like, where do you most effectively apply your attention? And one of the things that they talk about is if you don't have a proper characterisation of these catastrophic impacts, then your social cost of carbon that gets plugged into things like IAMs is going to be much lower than it would otherwise be. They also talk about the moral calculus, if I can put it like that, of just how many people could plausibly die in some of those scenarios, which is probably tough to plug into an integrated assessment model, but might be very effective in terms of focusing the minds of the public on what might need applying in terms of resources and attention to avoid, vast swathes of the human population dying off.
We just need the guts to turn the value of a statistical life into a hard dollar sum and say, that's it. We're monetizing that in our model.
I have the same thoughts in terms of how tricky it would be to, go through the exercise of quantifying various elements of what we're talking about and, garbage in, garbage out with IAMs and the like. But I guess the message that I was getting from this, and I certainly think they're recommending that in different places, was more aligned to our conversation about guardrails and having a clearer picture of just how bad the worst case looks like. And to your point earlier, Luke, getting very good at communicating that in a way that lands not just with policymakers but with the general public, to elicit the desired response, which is we absolutely don't want to be going off that cliff and possibly landing on a busload of small children at the bottom of it. Let's double down, triple our efforts on making sure that we're in line with a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. Like, to me, that was kind of the most useful sort of purpose that more work like this could serve. On top of, I'm a little conflicted here because you're sort of rightly saying once you start to see indicators of tipping points, is it all too late? And so at that point, are we meant to then just sit back and go, well, we're all,
called it.
We're all called it. We're all going to hell in a handbasket. Might as well buckle in and enjoy that trip over the cliff. Or are we going to think about what things might be done, should we get to that point, in terms of a global response. I mean, they even talk about things like firing, aerosols into the atmosphere that reflect sunlight, and they're very controversial.
Figures for geoengineering.
Yeah, and also the consequence of doing that is pretty poorly understood as well.
And their approach to understanding catastrophic risks would be interested in and relevant to understanding those catastrophic risks too, of which the one they name is like the one that has a cool name, which is termination shock. What happens if you suddenly stop doing the geoengineering because you've realised that it's causing some bad effects, say, on droughts in China or somewhere else, and you get a huge pulse of warming all at once once the sulfate aerosols settle out of the atmosphere. It's the title of a new-ish Neil Stephenson novel about these things, which unfortunately never quite delivers on its promise. Capsule review.
Or, I mean, effectively, once in the absence of some other technology coming and superseding it, you're committing for the rest of human civilization to maintaining those aerosols going up into the atmosphere. And so there's all kinds of reasons, plausibly, over the course of millennia that system might break down. I suppose to pick up, I guess, a strand of your argument, Frankie, and say, well, yes, this is worth thinking about, because is that even within the context of going over the cliff and the catastrophe, there's probably worse scenarios within that cohort of very bad scenarios and better ones, depending on how one manages the impacts. And if we do end up in that happy circumstances, it might be helpful for at least some people to have thought out what an appropriate response from various players and actors might be. But again, I keep coming back to this thing about where we are best placed to apply our time and attention.
This feels like one of those conversations where I go back to you, shouldn't we walk and chew gum at the same time?
I think that's a good argument. I think I'm convinced. So we're retasking some proportion of climate scientists, researchers, to contemplate the dark void of climate apocalypse. Does one of you want to set out, what that the end game research agenda should be?
Okay, so they propose 4 strands to this. Understanding extreme climate dynamics and impacts in the long term, so hothouse Earth scenarios, what are the tipping points and how do they interact? Exploring climate-triggered pathways to mass mortality and morbidity, where they observe... What
a cheery shopping list of research.
It's the stuff of which thesis dreams are made. Where they observe that in the current climate and health literature, only 9% of this looks at more extreme health or systemic risks, and the models rarely include adaptation, sort of cutting in the other direction here too. So they want bottom-up systems modelling to track hazards better. They want to apply models to high-temperature long-term scenarios, and they want to integrate societal risk work into those models. They want to investigate social fragility, which this is like, I think, the hardest, probably least convincing part of this. Like, you want to do it, but they say, well, let's, among other things, let's draw on pre-modern collapse case studies and try and reanalyse those to draw in how variations in population density and inequality and governance affected things to make that applicable to the contemporary world. I don't know about that. I don't know how much, like, Easter Island is going to tell you about the dynamics of collapse or anti-fragility even in a globally connected world. But they want to synthesise all that stuff into integrated catastrophe assessments. And I think they're talking a lot about expert elicitation, shades of the feel pinion laundering from a couple of episodes ago. And what came across to me is like simulation exercises, like getting people to play the parts of states and other actors, and get Jeffrey Robertson to throw some hypotheticals at them and see how they do. And they acknowledge this is going to provide rough probabilistic guides, and I think that's a generous description for what it's going to provide. And then they don't say time for some game theory, but they mean that all this stuff should be then subjected to decision making that's trying to avert the worst case scenarios, or to minimise loss in the worst case scenarios. Which draws in a whole bunch of game theory that is way over my head. Is that it? Is that the whole research?
No, I believe there was one more.
Oh, yes. I didn't say standardised catastrophic scenarios, which would be the equivalent of those standard socioeconomic pathways or the narratives that underpin successive generations of IPCC reports. This would be the catastrophic version of those. And they say the IPCC should be asked to do a big chunk of work in this space, which would inspire people to start filling in the gaps once they hear that there's a chance to get published.
I actually thought that was one of the more practical suggestions that could be acted on almost immediately, because they do note that, IPCC haven't yet given, focus to catastrophic climate change. And, they've done a bunch of special reports that have been published over the years, but none have focused in this area. And they did mention that I think a special focus on tipping points was committed to or suggested could be a focus as part of the seventh assessment cycle, and they're suggesting that that be broadened to include a lot of what they're talking about here, which is actually a pretty sensible thing to be calling for.
I totally agree.
Yeah, and the only other thing I was going to add a bit more colour to in your excellent summary of that research agenda was to pick up some of the elements of what they were talking about around mass morbidity and mortality, because I just love to focus in on cheery topics like that. And the stuff that had really caught my attention, and the way I guess they framed it, was like the four horsemen of the apocalypse in that setting, around famine and undernutrition, extreme weather events, conflict, and vector-borne diseases. And whilst that's a lovely list of things to be concerned about, I mean, they are things that we have experience with, and would be worth looking at how those risks would interact.
I think that's fair.
It goes to the way that you rebuild economies as well, right? And thinking about the resilience. I mean, we've just had this couple of years in which global supply chains have undergone a huge amount of disruption. We're thinking about in many quarters how that flows through into rebuilding those supply chains in a way that is far more resilient. There's obviously a geopolitical and defence element to all of this. How one would deal with a world where, regions, and the report makes this point, it's likely that the whole society wouldn't collapse around the world all at once. It would happen in certain regions at a given point in time, and how would that flow through, and how would, particular nations or regions that perhaps weren't directly impacted by that but were adjacent to it or were incurring some of the flow-on effects, how would they be best placed to respond or prepare to respond appropriately?
We could certainly be more prepared for bad outcomes than we are today.
One of the things I was thinking when I read about the recommendation on IPCC having a special report on catastrophic climate change, I would like to see the scope of that work extend further to deal with some of the things that you're talking about, Luke. I think their recommendation was more purely focused around climate tipping points and how those different risks might interact. But they didn't also talk about, I guess, how you could overlay a geopolitical lens on some of this and think about what recommendations for policymakers you could put in a report like this.
I guess I'm still left with my worry that the practical impact of all this potential work on solving the problems of climate change, it may not be large enough soon enough. Like the work may not be able to ultimately produce much that is actionable beyond, hey guys, don't push it, which is where we're at now, and it may take a lot of time to get there. I worry that it's a bit like saying to fight climate change, we need to develop a theory of quantum gravity. Because if we had a unified understanding of physics, that would unlock new research directions and technologies that would ultimately help us to solve a bunch of energy problems better than we could do today. And that might be true, but it also might take 50 or 100 years to deliver that. It's like you're starting at problems that are far upstream of how do you re-engineer the world's economy to no longer spit out any units of CO2 per unit of GDP and preserve the growth of GDP for an awful lot of places that need it in the process. That's like a huge problem that needs a lot of people on it. And I think social scientists are great and their talents matter. And maybe we should have them on the more tractable parts of this problem. So I'm again it. I thought this was a really interesting paper, but I'm again it.
I think Frankie's for it. You say yes, retask some percentage of folk to focus on catastrophic endgames.
Yeah, well, maybe the pitch is there should just be more people looking at this stuff, full stop. So we should be recruiting more keen beavers to do research work off the back of undergrads or PhDs or something like that. But I guess the people who would be needed to look at the scientific elements of catastrophic climate risks, would their presence be missed in further mapping the impact of 1.5 to 2 degrees? Like I feel like we kind of know what we need to do there, and the mitigation, like the task, like we know what we need to do. Let's just bloody get on with it.
I think we still have problems to solve there. We've made progress. I will not deny that we've made progress, but I think we've got more progress to make.
I think it is fair to say, like they lay out a big agenda here, right?
Yep.
It'll take a lot of time and attention, but there are elements of it that could be pursued and productively so by expanding the scope of the work of folk that are already doing things. Integrating in some of those catastrophic scenarios into work that's already underway, and sort of trying to think through how that would play out in particular models. The idea of the IPCC special report, I think. It would be potentially incredibly helpful in terms of shaping the public's understanding of what a worst-case scenario would look like. So maybe there's a middle ground here. Maybe we can do some of what they say without necessarily completely upending the global climate research agenda team.
Grubby centrism saves the day again, Luke.
It is my strong bias. All right, as always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. And I think, Tennant, given the sombre nature of the pod so far, we're all committing to a upbeat one more thing. What have you got?
So I have been very eccentrically reading a failed work, well, uncharitably described, a failed work of 70s futurism, The High Frontier by Gerard K. O'Neill, a Princeton professor who surveyed the social and economic problems of the world in the 70s as he saw them, as many people saw them at the time: resource constraints, pollution, energy running out, concerns about the sustainability of population and
the population bomb, Tennant.
Yeah, well, he had a I've got to say, a much more defensible view of population matters than some of those people running around in the 70s who had a pretty ill-concealed streak of racism in their views of who was the problem. There's none of that in O'Neill, but what there is an eccentric solution, which is that the solution to all these problems is giant space colonies.
Cool.
To build truly massive colonies out in space, and their main industry, other than building more giant space colonies, which would be a very big industry indeed, would be to build orbital solar power stations, which would obviate the need for any other earthbound energy sources. He's very down on earthbound renewable energy. He's very down on nuclear power. He's very up on multi-thousand-ton solar power stations in orbit, and he's got a whole future vision of bootstrapping massive industries that unfortunately rested on the slender reed of NASA's estimates for what it was going to be able to do with the space shuttle,
Right.
Which didn't work out very well.
So out of interest, how is the solar power getting back to the Earth?
The power will be beamed down in microwaves to large rectenna facilities that are low enough impact in land use that you could be grazing cattle in that land. He's very keen on it, and he paints a delightful picture of the high living standards and low density living in these space colonies of the future. The reason why it's not a totally irrelevant relic, I think, is that one, it's nicely bringing me down to earth in reading just how wrong a quite bright fellow could get things 50 years ago. But two, in line with that Keynes comment about practical men of industry often being the slaves of some defunct economist, this guy has had a lasting impact, and Jeff Bezos is basically a disciple of this book. This is the ideas behind his flavour of billionaire space activities. Elon Musk, totally different. Elon Musk doesn't agree with almost anything in this book, I would say. But Jeff Bezos is all about the Gerard K. O'Neill move industry off Earth and into space, and that's how we'll clean up the environment vision. It's got some problems, in execution, but that's what they're trying to do. Maybe that's the answer for our catastrophic risk assessments. Just move all the people and the industry off the Earth.
Are the space colonies all just orbiting Earth, or are they terraforming on other exoplanets?
He doesn't like planets. Gerard K. O'Neill thinks planets are a waste of space. No, it's all about doing things in the high frontier, and the best place to be in the medium term. The best place to be in 1995, as he saw it, for when we should have some of these giant colonies underway, is L5, one of the Lagrange points in the Earth-Moon-Sun system, where you can stick something and it will more or less stay there due to the interactions of the gravitational influence of those three bodies. I'm going on a long time, but sometimes he says it will be so attractive to locate industry in orbit that earthbound industry won't be able to compete. Whole industries will just move there. But then at other times he does acknowledge that it won't make a great deal of sense to send anything down to Earth in terms of like goods. It won't make sense to send goods down. So I think he's in common with a lot of stuff by space enthusiasts. I think ultimately everything is just an excuse to do stuff in space because it's cool.
It is cool. I think we can all agree on that tenet. May I draw this extended one more thing to a close?
For now, sure. The sun never sets on an orbital solar power station, but it is set on my part of this segment.
All right. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I could crash us back down to Earth, to Sydney, somewhere on George Street, to be precise, last week. I want to recap on our joint venture in hosting the Energy Efficiency Summit 2022, and I just wanted to reflect on what a great event it was, and like super interesting insights from the California Energy Commissioner, Andrew McAllister, or AMAC as he's been christened. I think he made some really powerful arguments around governance of energy markets, to consider the demand side in a much more structured way that we could take on board here. And I also want to reflect on a very exciting announcement from Jenny McAllister, the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, who at the summit committed to a national energy performance strategy to be launched sometime in the middle of next year in 2023, which is a very exciting prospect for all of us, of course in our day jobs, but more generally I think it's just really exciting that the demand side is going to have its moment and that we get to talk details about the kinds of policies that need to be brought to bear. And I thought perhaps one of my best takeouts from the conversation around all of that probably came courtesy of Alison Reeve, who made the point that it needs to be actually strategic, and that what we're not talking about here is just a shopping list of different policies that need to go in this thing, that we need to think about how we would prioritise different measures and how cross-cutting measures that are going to impact on different sectors of the economy from an efficiency perspective should be thought about. So anyway, I thought it was a great do, and many congrats and hats off to you, Luke, and the team at EEC for doing the heavy lifting. And it was great to see it happen, and very excited to see what comes next.
It was absolutely a team effort. So that was EEC, Property Council, ACOS and AI Group tenant. You unable to make it.
I was gutted.
We missed you.
laid low with COVID. Did you catch any of it from your sickbed?
No, I was unconscious for the entirety of that conference, but I'm very delighted that it was such a success.
All captured on video, so you'll be able to catch up on the highlights at least at your leisure. All right, well, thanks, Frankie. Important to acknowledge that it's a big milestone for energy efficiency policy, and it's going to be a key focus for all of us for the next 6 months or so to support the government in landing that strategy. My one more thing is actually an article that I came across in The Economist called "The Energy Transition Will Be Expensive, but Not Catastrophically So." And I thought it was a useful insight into, I guess, the elements of the energy transition that we often spend less time talking about. Talk a lot about the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. We talk a bit about hydrogen. We talk less about, I guess, retrofitting the technologies that use energy in homes and businesses across the countryside, across suburbs, right around the world. And this particular article was drawing an analogy between the task that the UK government took on back in 1965 when they struck gas in the North Sea. And they thought, well, we should be using this fantastic new resource. So they went about retrofitting, I think, 13 million British homes, taking them off town gas and on to fossil gas. An incredible undertaking that took a touch over a decade, and they're recruiting people from all over the British economy to roll up their sleeves and support this effort. And they draw the connection between what will need to take place in Britain and Europe and other parts around the world in the transition from gas boilers to heat pumps. So I just thought it was useful framing that we've talked about in our wonk circles quite a bit in terms of the task of sort of pulling together that big new workforce. There are analogies to past efforts. It hasn't been talked so much in the public domain, and I thought it was really interesting to see, at least in the lofty turrets of The Economist, some of these scenarios starting to be unpacked, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's very reassuring. We've done big stuff before. We can do big stuff again.
And everyone gets to learn how to install a heat pump.
That is the clear implication of this. This is absolutely a joint effort.
Yes.
All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich. Tennant is at Tennant Reid. And my handle is at Luke Menzel. And you can email us with feedback or something you want us to cover on a future episode of Let Me Sum Up at mailbag@letmesumup.net. Never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your favourite podcast app, and you'll find all of our episodes, all 10 of them, at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. So this marks 10 episodes.
Yeah.
It's not bad, is it?
Should have said something on the podcast.
Well, you did say 10 at the very, very end, but no, we didn't make a big deal of it.
I think that if we've proven one thing over the course of those 10 episodes, we're fantastic self-promoters.
Oh, yeah, we didn't tell people to like, subscribe, rate, or review this time at all. We didn't threaten them. We didn't promise, delights. Nothing.
No sugar and no spice.
And I even had the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, mentioned. Oh, damn. I'll have to revisit that next time.